I am biased, and so are you. And so are news media organizations, and that's okay. Bias is unavoidable and inevitable. But that's why I use Ground News. It's a website and app that shows me how different news publications are biased, how reliable their reporting is, and who funds them. And it conveniently gathers news sources from the right, left, and center into a single place, so I can understand how different news organizations are covering the exact same events. Ground News even has a blind spot feed that features news stories receiving a disproportionate amount of coverage on one side of the political spectrum. So if you want to better understand the media's biases and your own, go check out ground.news. And if you end up wanting to subscribe, you can get 15% off by using my link in the show notes. Your subscription supports this podcast and helps make the news media more transparent. And now, on to the episode. I'm your host, Michael Callahan. This is Where We Go Next. And investigations into how COVID-19 began have been clouded by political partisanship and obstruction. But why has the lab leak hypothesis specifically been so controversial and dismissed by so many? Our returning guest this week shares the evidence pointing toward a research lab in Wuhan, China, the political and scientific hurdles she's faced researching the pandemic's origins over the last 4 years, and what it all means for future research on dangerous pathogens. Alina Chan is a molecular biologist at the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard, and co-author of Viral, The Search for the Origin of COVID-19. She was a member of the Pathogens Project, which the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists organized to generate new thinking on responsible, high-risk pathogen research. Alina, thanks so much for joining us again.
Thanks for having me back on the show.
I'm glad that we're both glad that you're here. Now, you've been investigating the origins of COVID-19 since 2020, and you were one of the first to raise the alarm that the virus may have originated in a lab. You and I first spoke in June of 2021, only about 3 weeks after Facebook reversed its ban on all posts that claimed that COVID-19 originated in a lab, labeling these claims as, quote, misinformation. The ban was reversed just a day after President Biden instructed intelligence agencies to pursue all plausible origin theories, including a lab leak. In March of 2023, Congress passed the COVID-19 Origin Act, and the president signed it into law. The act mandated that the Director of National Intelligence declassify any information about potential links between the Wuhan Institute of Virology and COVID-19's origins. Now, here we are in 2024. And on June 3rd, the New York Times published your essay, quote, Why the Pandemic Probably Started in a Lab in 5 Key Points, end quote. So to start us off, Alina, between 2021 and today, what has changed about the information we have available about COVID's origins? Before we get into the meat of your 5-point essay and the case that you make, I want to understand where this new information came from and how it came to be.
I think that the most significant revelation about the origin of COVID-19 since June of 2021 was the leaking of a research proposal co-written by the EcoHealth Alliance, a US nonprofit that collaborated with the Wuhan Institute of Virology, as well as the University of North Carolina. There's a famous coronavirologist there, Ralph Baric. In 2018, they had written this research proposal, which some have described to be as close as you can get to a recipe for COVID-19. So this document was leaked in the fall of 2021 by someone who used to work in the US government. But after that, I don't think much more has changed. I think that there's been pretty much stagnation on this topic since that time in 2021. Until today, I think we can all agree that both natural and lab hypotheses are plausible and have to be investigated. The US government and intelligence agencies believe this, the World Health Organization believes this, and many scientists agree. So the problem is that there seems to be some US intelligence that could potentially strengthen the case for lab origin, but the Office of the Director of National Intelligence refuses to declassify it. And this is despite a bill that was unanimously approved in the House and Senate and then signed into law by Biden last year. So there's a big question mark of what is this intelligence and why can't the public see it?
You said something there that I want to make sure that we hammer home for our listeners as we continue this discussion, which is that both theories, both the natural origin for COVID-19 and the lab leak theory, that both are plausible. I want to make sure that we say that right up front because we're going to be getting into not just your essay in the New York Times, the research that you've done on COVID origins, but also some of the pushback you've received from fellow scientists. But I want to state right up front, you're not saying that the natural origins of COVID-19 aren't plausible. You're stating that both your theory and the natural origin theory are both plausible.
Yes, they are both plausible. The only disagreement is which one is more likely.
Understood. Early in your New York Times essay, you write, quote, "For more than 4 years, reflexive partisan politics have derailed the search for the truth about a catastrophe that has touched us all," end quote. And I think all of us have seen this play out personally. The same month that you and I first spoke in June of 2021, Jon Stewart appeared on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert and asserted that the coronavirus that originated in Wuhan, China, probably came from the Wuhan Institute of Virology that specialized in coronavirus research. And the backlash that he received from his side of the aisle, fellow liberals, I guess you could say, was extreme. I remember it. And it was crazy to see because Jon Stewart for so many decades has been revered as a truth teller. And so recounting the experience 2 years later in 2023, Stewart said, quote, "I thought it was a pretty good bit that expressed kind of how I felt. And the two things that came out of it were, I'm a racist against Asian people, and how dare I align myself with the alt-right," end quote. I personally found that reaction kind of bewildering and distressing because as I understand science, I am not a scientist, but as I understand it, science is a process, and the most important thing should be the pursuit of truth. And how can the pursuit of truth be controversial? I understand that politics are going to politic, Alina, but you faced similar backlash and smears from within the scientific community, from your own peers. Why?
I think there are two different questions here, right? So why is a lab leak seen as a racist right-wing conspiracy theory? And then the second question is, why are scientists so against it? So I'll answer the first one first. I think from my point of view, being an Asian person allowed me to ask this question to a greater extent than most of my peers who are not Asian. So, but even as an Asian, I was already labeled like xenophobic or self-hating Asian or racist against myself or race traitor. So a lot of these labels came flying at me, but underneath it all, you just have to remember that the truth is the truth. So like the science, the facts, it says that both a lab and natural origin are both on the table. So the problem is that back then in 2020, and even today, I think that the political temperature is very high. So people are always trying to find ways to attack their opponents rather than to find ways to collaborate and fix problems that they both agree exist. I think it has not gotten better, unfortunately. So 4 years of pandemic has not made people more friendly to each other or more cooperative with each other. I think it's only escalated. So even after in 2021, as you said, the US government said both theories on the table. Those who said it was racist to say it could come from a lab, they just dug in deeper. So most of them just refused to U-turn. They just continued to say that this is a right-wing conspiracy theory. So coming to the second question about why some scientists are so against this, I wanted to share a quote with you from the host of a podcast, a very popular podcast amongst virologists. It's called This Week in Virology.
I'm familiar, yeah.
Yeah, so this host, Vincent Racconello, he said in February 2020, this was way before I appeared on the scene, February 2020, he said, "It really bothered me that there was some suggestion that this was a lab construct. Because if it turned out to be true, that would bother the hell out of me. Not just because of people dying and so forth, but it's kind of an indictment of the field, right?" So he spoke honestly, I think, from the heart at that point. He said that it is going to be so terrible if this came from a lab because it will indict my field. It will indict the field of virology. So for scientists, they realized this, that if the public realized that this came from a lab, if it turned out that evidence came out that this came from a lab, the backlash, the blame, the attacks on virologists and other scientists would be immense.
One thing that has bugged me, and I can partially understand why scientists would want to close ranks in that respect, although I personally don't know how one lab in one region of the world being potentially unsafe or careless is an indictment on all scientists everywhere, in the same way that the Me Too movement within Hollywood wasn't a condemnation of every actor and every director to ever live. It's just about pointing out bad behavior within an industry, not an indictment of that entire industry. So I'm not entirely sure I follow why the reaction was that way. But something else that's always bothered me is this idea that a potential accident in a highly advanced lab is considered more racist than the idea that Chinese people are eating exotic animals in dangerous conditions. Because it seems like the lab leak theory would actually be, if we're calling things racist, it would actually be considered less racist to say, hey, highly advanced lab, accidents happen. I guess I've always been confused as to why that was labeled the more racist theory.
I completely agree. So the lab leak hypothesis is like 0% racist, in my opinion. If anything, you're admitting that there's a lab in China that is so advanced that it's accidentally creating pathogens that could cause pandemics. So I think that in contrast, the wet market idea is so rooted in stereotypes about Chinese people that a lot of people, when they think of Wuhan now, they still see this like back country, like, oh, there's animals in cages everywhere, people eating like pangolins and cats and bats and that kind of thing. And when you Google it and you look at what Wuhan is, oh my gosh, it's like way more modern than most US cities. And you look at it, it's like, whoa, it's a huge city, like skyscrapers everywhere, like
very futuristic.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get to the 5 points from your essay. Your first point, the same one that Jon Stewart pointed out on The Late Show in 2021, is, quote, the SARS-like virus that caused the pandemic emerged in Wuhan, the city where the world's foremost research lab for SARS-like viruses is located, end quote. Talk us through the work that was being done with SARS-like viruses by scientists at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and why and how the Yunnan province 1,000 miles away is important.
So we have to rewind time to about 20 years ago. So this is the 2003 SARS epidemic. When that epidemic of a SARS-like virus occurred in Guangdong province, so this is another South China province, it really shook up the entire scientific community in China. Like people were really interested in trying to track down these viruses. And at the front of those scientists was this lab from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So even though they were located 1,000 miles away up in central China, they got really energized, really interested in finding these viruses. So most years, they would just make all these trips, multiple trips down into South China and even down into Southeast Asia to look for these viruses. And what they found, and they published in 2019, was that these viruses were really concentrated in those southern Chinese provinces, particularly Yunnan province. So this is a place where the closest virus relatives to both the 2003 SARS and the COVID-19 SARS-CoV-2 virus have been found. So the closest relatives have been found only in Yunnan and Laos, so just across the border in Southeast Asia from Yunnan province. So they wrote in 2019 that this sort of spillover, this type of virus jumping from bats or animals into people was rare. So this was their stance. They said, we've been researching these viruses, collecting them for more than a decade, and it's rare. It's rare for these viruses to jump directly into people and then to start outbreaks. But if you look at their statements now, after the pandemic, they're like, oh, this is happening everywhere. And the EcoHealth Alliance, which is this close US collaborator of the Wuhan scientists, they estimate that some 60,000 people are getting infected with bad SARS-like viruses every year. This is a complete flip of their pre-pandemic stance, which was informed by their own science, where they said this sort of thing is rare.
Why the change from saying it's rare to saying it's common?
My guess is that they wanted to just tell people that, oh, this sort of thing happens all the time. So just because it happened in our city doesn't mean that it came from our lab.
Interesting. Does this point to a conspiracy? What I'd like to try to do throughout this conversation is also try and steelman the opposition, try to steelman the natural origin a little bit. But when I hear a statement like that, where officials are saying, both in the US and China, that something is very rare and that something is common, it doesn't pass the smell test to me.
I think it's important to look at what the data actually is. And what the data is that they had only found a few people in Yunnan province who had antibodies against SARS-like viruses. So they even looked across other southern Chinese provinces and did not find anyone with antibodies against these SARS-like viruses. So this is putting, of course, aside the 2003 SARS-like epidemic. So clearly the people who had been infected during that time, they were previous cases of SARS viruses. But that data, it just tells you that this sort of virus jumping from nature into humans was very localized and rare even. And the people that they found were positive were people living like within visual distance of these bats. They were living very close to caves where they had found exactly those viruses residing in bats. So it's not like everyone who sees a bat flying around is suddenly like a potential victim of a SARS-like spillover.
Well, you mentioned the 2003 SARS outbreak. So these outbreaks are rare, to your point, but they're not impossible. I guess if I'm trying to steelman the opposition here, if the 1,000-mile distance between the Yunnan province and Wuhan is significant, couldn't a case be made for natural origin despite that distance? Like if an animal came in contact with a coronavirus infected bat in or around Yunnan, and then that infected animal, or maybe another animal that animal infected, who knows how many animals could have gotten infected along the way, couldn't an infected animal make its way to Wuhan or infect an animal or a couple animals that make their way to Wuhan? To put it another way, is it not possible that the virus could have traveled that 1,000 miles within one or several infected animals?
Yes, it's possible and plausible. So the natural origin must still be investigated. And there's still several routes left to be investigated for natural origin. But what I would argue is that the evidence that's been found for SARS 2003, as well as MERS, another related coronavirus, strongly contrasts with the evidence that exists for COVID-19. So in the case of both SARS 2003 as well as MERS, they found numerous infected animals, numerous animals that were exposed to these early cases. So many of the early cases were people like chefs or like waitresses or animal delivery people, or in the case of MERS, people who handled camels. So a lot of these people directly handled these animals, were exposed to them on a regular basis in their profession, as well as they found antibody evidence. So in the case of the SARS 2003 epidemic, they found that when they drew blood from a lot of the wildlife vendors, the people with the highest portion of antibodies against these SARS-like viruses were people who had sold civet cats. Civet cats were one of these species that were considered very likely to be the intermediate host, the host between a bat and a human that allows the virus to adapt and jump and cause an outbreak in people. Furthermore, in the case of SARS and MERS, they found ancestral variants of the virus, both in other animals as well as in bats. And in the case of SARS 2003, as you said, it's a long distance between Yunnan and Guangdong, both southern Chinese provinces, but still a very long distance apart. So what these scientists in Wuhan actually found is that near these caves where they had found the closest relatives to the 2003 SARS, they had found that there was a farm directly supplying Guangdong. So there's a civet farm. They were raising all the civet cats and directly shipping them up into Guangdong province or across into Guangdong province. So there was a clearly established route between the natural reservoir of the virus, there's an intermediate host farm there, sending these animals down across the country to Guangdong. So there are all these very strong pieces of direct evidence of a natural origin of the 2003 SARS virus. And you know who wrote the textbook? It was these Wuhan scientists. So in the case of COVID-19, though, it's completely opposite. Until today, 4 years on, 0 infected animals, no early cases known to have directly handled these animals or to been exposed to them on a professional level, no antibody evidence that these sort of viruses were circulating in animals or people in Wuhan, no ancestral variants of the virus found in animals in the market or close by, no documented trade of such intermediate host animals from Yunnan up into Wuhan specifically.
Right. And this is all from the fifth point in your essay, the overwhelming evidence for the SARS and MERS origins compared to the lack of evidence we seem to have for the natural origin theory around COVID-19. Kind of reminds me of, have you seen that 2011 movie Contagion by Steven Soderbergh?
Yes.
I watched it for the first time in April of 2020, which was a mistake. That really made me much more anxious than I was before I watched it. But it kind of reminds me of that movie because in that movie, like we get to see exactly which animal it came from, exactly the first infected human, how that human became infected, how that human infected other humans. What you're saying here is that we have that chain of events for SARS 2003 and MERS, but we don't have that chain for COVID.
Yes.
Okay. Going back, we went to point 5. We're going to come back now to point 2. Point 2, you say, quote, the year before the outbreak, the Wuhan Institute, working with U.S. partners, had proposed creating viruses with SARS-CoV-2's defining feature, end quote. And then you say, quote, the Wuhan lab ran risky experiments to learn about how SARS-like viruses might infect humans, end quote. And I would love for you to expand on this. What's the best case scenario for why scientists in Wuhan and the US would want to create viruses like this?
So these scientists internationally were trying to get ahead of viruses. They were trying to predict and preempt pandemics by collecting all these novel viruses from nature and making a giant database of them and then figuring out how they could create therapeutics or vaccines to counter these viruses should they jump into people at some point. The problem with this is that the idea is noble, but the execution is a disaster. So you imagine, okay, you have all these Chinese scientists collecting and amassing all of these tens of thousands of viruses samples in their lab. Who controls access to that collection? What if the government came in and said, we want to use this collection? Can any of these scientists stand in the way and say no? And then in the case of this pandemic, when it happened, that collection was not made available, even though it had been co-funded by US funding, even federal funding. So money from the NIH, money from the Defense Department had flowed into this database. They all did not have access to this virus sample database when the pandemic happened.
I just want to clarify this point. The US government was co-funding the research and experiments that were being done at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, but that funding didn't come with any conditions around transparency?
I think they had naively believed that this data would be shared. So I think that this is a problem because it's not even just limited to China, right? So this sort of work was happening with many other countries besides like in the US. And the problem is that now who can open up all these vaults of samples of viruses and sequences? So it is in a lot of countries' interest to withhold some of that data. So if you're the one owning this database, you don't necessarily want to share everything with everyone.
We'll circle back to that point because it's hard to... I'm having the same reaction I had when you and I first spoke, where you're saying things and sharing information that, like the idea that the US government was using American tax dollars to fund research that was happening in a lab that we did not have full access to and did not have oversight on. It distresses me. I'm imagining people are hearing this and they're like, why would the government do this? Why wouldn't the US government, instead of collaborating with a lab or a country that wouldn't share this information? Because we have a semi-adversarial relationship with the Chinese government. I'm setting aside Chinese scientists, right? Because I think you have to separate the people from the government. But we have a semi-adversarial, an increasingly adversarial relationship with China. You know, it seems to me from all the countries that we could have possibly collaborated with, in all the labs around all the countries friendly to the United States that we could have co-funded, that would have given us access, I'm struggling to understand why we chose this lab in this country, knowing what the Chinese government is capable of.
So I think to explain this story, we have to keep in mind what the EcoHealth Alliance, their role was in the story. The EcoHealth Alliance is this US nonprofit that's based in New York. The president is someone called Peter Daszak, and he had joined in with the Wuhan scientists way back in the early 2000s to try and find the source of that 2003 SARS virus. And so when the US started to get more and more interested in virus discovery and predicting and preventing outbreaks, he started to market all these international collaborations as a way to collect these novel viruses, right? So if you want to find these SARS-like viruses that jump from nature into people, China and Southeast Asia are the place. So it's not that why did they choose China of all places? They kind of had to, because the SARS-like viruses are there.
Because that's where so many viruses were originating.
Yeah, and that's the argument that Anthony Fauci, the ex-head of the NIAID, the Infectious Diseases Agency in the US, that's the reason that he gave as well. So why do you go to China? Is because the viruses are there. Again, I think the idea is perfectly fine, but the execution was terrible. They had no ways of making sure that they had access to the samples and the data. So this was also examined in recent hearings in Congress where Peter Daszak was interrogated. So they asked him, you don't have access to the samples, right? And he said, yeah, we never had access to the samples. And what about the database? He's like, I never asked for the database. So, I mean, it's a huge mess. And I think that no more money should go into these virus discovery programs unless these new systems can be put in place so that the US funders have access to both the samples and the data.
Yeah, it seems obvious, just speaking as a layperson without any scientific or political background sitting here in Los Angeles. Hearing you say that sounds incredibly obvious. But you mentioned that the experiments were risky. Why were the experiments they were doing in Wuhan risky?
So a lot of people say that the work in Wuhan was gain of function. But it's important to point out that this term gain of function is really ambiguous. It's really broad, and everyone has their own definition of it almost. What it means by itself, principally, gain of function just means that a new function has been gained. So that function could be anything, right? It could be that it's making it more deadly in people, or it could be that you just made it glow in the dark. But the definition that most people are arguing about was the one that was used in 2017, when there was a new regulation put in place about what sorts of research the US federal funding could go to. And so this gain of function research of concern was defined as any work that reasonably would increase the transmissibility or deadliness of a pathogen that was already reasonably perceived to be both highly transmissible and highly deadly in people. So the problem with such a strict definition is that reasonably is doing a lot of work. So it depends on who's the judge, who's the reviewer. So if the scientists who are reviewing the proposals look at it and they said, I don't think this is going to cause a pandemic, then it just goes through. It couldn't prevent work on novel viruses, because if you collect all these novel SARS-like viruses and MERS-like viruses from bats, let's say, how would you know that it's already a pandemic pathogen? How would you know what experiments could make them a pandemic pathogen? So a lot of this work continues today, even under today's laws, just unchecked, because they do not meet that high standard of what would be considered a risky gain-of-function research of concern.
I've heard of chimeric viruses. What is the difference between a chimeric virus and a virus made from gain-of-function research?
I'll walk through the workflow of what the scientists in Wuhan were doing. So they would go down to these caves and they would take swabs from these bats. They were also sampling wild animals and even sick people. So sick people living near these caves or sick people associated with the wildlife trades, they would draw blood from them to see whether they had been exposed to these viruses. And if they were positive, they would follow up and take like nasal swabs and things like that. But mainly, most of their samples were from bats. So they would take all these samples back to Wuhan. They would try to grow the viruses from these samples. If they found a sample that had a virus in it, they would try to grow the virus in the lab. And the way that virologists do this routinely, so not just this lab in Wuhan, is that they would pass the viruses through cells in the lab. So these cells are typically primate cells, monkey cells. They would try to grow the virus in it over multiple passages until they saw the viruses growing really well. And then that's the strain they would use in their lab. So to a lot of people, this sort of virus, where you've passed it through monkey cells or human cells many times, is still considered a natural virus. So if it had escaped from the lab, they would say that's a lab escape of a natural virus. But where you get into chimera or gain of function is where you are taking parts of these viruses. So even before the pandemic, these scientists in Wuhan, as well as in the US, had already gained the ability to synthesize these viruses from scratch. So as long as they know the sequence, they can mix and match the sequences between different viruses, and they can synthesize it and grow those viruses in the lab. And if you had a mix and match, these would be called chimera. So they would be growing these viruses, and in their work, they would be infecting all sorts of cells with them, including human airway cells, to see how these viruses could cause disease. And so in this process, I think that there's a good chance that these viruses are getting better and better at infecting human cells and monkey cells in the lab. And so for some people, that level of work is already quite concerning. And so you're already making these viruses progressively better at infecting people, at infecting human cells. So where I think it clearly crosses the line into gain-of-function research of concern, and this describes work that was not at the Wuhan Institute. So this actually describes work that we know about in the US, is where you're taking a known human pathogen, like a bird flu virus or a monkeypox virus. You know that these viruses can already infect people, and then you give it an ability that you know will make it worse. So in the case of bird flu, they were trying to make this virus that already causes quite high mortality in people, they were trying to make it spread faster between ferrets, mammals in the lab. And in the case of monkeypox, they were trying to cross a highly transmissible strain to a highly deadly strain. So in that category, which actually happens in the US, it is a clear gain-of-function research of concern.
I want to be careful in terms of how I use this phrase, because I think it has been weaponized against people like yourself, but I think I need to use it here. I think there has been a conspiracy theory-like idea, and maybe it's not a conspiracy theory. I don't know. You might know more about this than I do. But there's been this idea among some, and I think when people hear what you just said about taking a virus and making it more transmissible or more deadly, one theory I've heard, which I don't personally believe, but I'd love to hear your opinion on it, is that scientists in China were trying to make a virus that was more deadly and weaponize it against other people around the world. I don't personally find that a very compelling case, but also I think when someone hears what you're saying and thinks to themselves, why would anyone want to make a virus more deadly? Why would anyone want to make a virus more transmissible? What's the benevolent explanation behind that research? And I guess what is the evidence against the idea that scientists within a country with a potentially hostile government could be making viruses that could be weaponized against their enemies?
So this debate of whether it's worthwhile to do gain-of-function research of concern has been raging on for like even 10 years before the pandemic started. So on the one hand, the people say, yes, it's worth doing, it's a risk worth taking, and that included Dr. Anthony Fauci. The reason is that they wanted to prevent future pandemics. And so to them, the best way of doing that was to make these pandemic viruses in the lab first, so that when you see those similar mutations in the wild, you can know that there's a risk there and then pay more attention to it. And hopefully, if you're making these pandemic pathogens in the lab, you'll also be making vaccines and therapeutics that are proven effective against them, and you can stockpile these for future pandemics.
Just to repeat what you said so I make sure I understand it, the idea was that they would create new versions of these viruses in a lab so that when those same new versions appeared in the wild, they would know how to combat those new versions of the virus. I guess the question that pops into my mind immediately is, if you synthetically create a new virus in a lab, how could that same exact version ever appear naturally in the wild? Why would that virus occur somehow naturally if you're synthesizing it in a laboratory?
So I think that there's some overlap, but that point is a good one. And many scientists have actually made that point already before the pandemic. They said that you can be collecting all of these millions of viruses out in the wild, and you're still not going to know which one is going to cause a pandemic next. And you might not have sampled that one even. So the things that you make in the lab, sometimes they can simulate nature. So for example, trying to make the bird flu transmissible in mammals, they were copying mutations they had already seen in nature. So they're trying to see if those mutations actually did confer the ability to jump easily amongst mammals. Some of the mutations can simulate what has been seen in nature, but some of them can be completely new things that maybe nature has not even explored itself. So the opponents of gain-of-function research are concerned. Their argument is that this is like looking for a gas leak with a lighted match. So you are creating the risk that you're trying to combat.
You're creating the conditions that you're trying to prevent.
Yes, you're creating the risk, as in you're creating all these viruses in the lab, and so there's a risk of these jumping out and causing a pandemic.
I mean, where do you fall in terms of how you feel about gain-of-function? Is the juice worth the squeeze? Are the potential upsides of gain-of-function research worth the risks that come with it?
So far, this specific class of research with pandemic risk has not provided the benefits it promised. None of this work enhancing viruses in the lab to become more transmissible or deadly in people has paid off. So I have not seen any paper or any finding where such work was done and then it resulted in a vaccine or a therapy, like with COVID-19 or for any other thing. Again, just to be clear, right? There's lots of other gain-of-function research that is helping something to grow well so that you can study in the lab. I don't consider that to be like gain-of-function research or concern. So there is this just very tiny sliver of research that actually has pandemic risk. And so far, I have not seen any benefits from that.
So to reiterate what you're saying, gain of function is a process that can be used for all kinds of things, not even related necessarily to viruses or making viruses more deadly. It can be used in all sorts of non-related benevolent ways. You're just saying that in this specific instance of using gain of function to create versions of viruses that are potentially more deadly or transmissible in order to potentially get ahead of them if they then appear in the wild, you're just saying that that specific sliver of gain of function research, in your view, has not proven useful.
Yes, exactly.
Speaking of risk, let's talk about the third point in your essay, safety conditions within the Wuhan Institute of Virology labs. I'd like to share a quote from your first appearance on this show in which you state a fact that I have shared with many people since then, and it shocks every person I've ever told. You said, quote, "This idea of there being some international body checking up on labs around the world, it doesn't exist. There are some guidelines that are published, but nobody knows exactly what research is happening around the world. And we don't even know how many BSL-3 labs there are or even BSL-2 labs. We don't know how many there are and what they're doing," end quote. In your New York Times piece, it similarly noted, quote, "Biosafety levels are not internationally standardized, and some countries use more permissive protocols than others," end quote. So for our audience, BSL stands for biosafety level. My question for you, Alina, is what do those four levels, BSL 1, 2, 3, and 4, represent? And what are the differences between those four levels? How is a BSL 1 lab different from a BSL 4 lab? And specifically as it relates to this, what are the major differences between BSL 2 and BSL 3?
If you look at BSL 1 through 4, 1 is the lowest level of biosafety, and then 4 is the highest level of biosafety. So we know that the Wuhan lab had from levels 2 up to 4. And where the coronavirus research was done was actually at 2 and 3. So this is where live viruses had been handled. And even though it's just an increment of one number, the differences between each level are vast. So some virologists will even say that BSL 2 is really actually the lowest biosafety level, because one is almost like anything can happen. So some people are like eating, no gloves, just touching everything at BSL-1. Some of that can actually happen at BSL-2 too. So I mean, I've seen places where there's eating and drinking happening at BSL-2. I've seen places, some BSL-2s, where people are touching everything with their gloves.
Jeez.
So touching their faces, touching their phones, touching door handles, touching keyboards, like common surfaces completely, everyone's just touching it. So BSL-2, even that can happen. And those levels vary a lot around the world. BSL-3 is where it becomes more serious. It is where like people are like, all right, there's actually stuff here that we're afraid of that could actually cause outbreaks. And so this is where the biohazard suits actually come in. But even at BSL-3 with the biohazard suits, you still have a lot of room for human error. And this was shown at the end of 2021 when SARS-CoV-2 jumped out of a BSL-3 lab in Taiwan. So this was already like 2 years into the pandemic. This was December 2021. So Taiwan at the time was a zero COVID country. So it was like aggressively contact tracing and testing anyone who could be a COVID-19 case. And so that's the only reason that they were able to know that it had jumped out of a lab. So in contrast, in places like the US, where almost everybody was having COVID, there's no way you could tell whether someone had gotten COVID in the lab or on the bus. So in Taiwan, the zero COVID country, they realized that it had leaked from a lab, and they immediately quarantined like over 100 people who had been exposed to the infected person. And they went into the lab, they reviewed all these videotapes, and they saw like multiple sources of potential human error that could have led to the virus escaping. And this included things like taking off their mask before taking off their gloves.
Oh my God.
All these just very slight human errors can result in a risk, right? So at times, like they found that there was contamination of the virus on the tables and the doors and that kind of thing. So they realized that it wasn't foolproof. So even a BSL-3 was not foolproof. And then BSL-4 is a whole another level on top of that. And every time you go up one level, the cost and the type of skilled personnel you need, it escalates exponentially. So there's so many people who can do work at BSL-2. But at BSL-3, that number shrinks, I don't know, by maybe at least 1,000-fold. I don't think that many people around the world can work at BSL-3 because it is hours and hours of training, investing in people to work at that level.
What you just said reminds me of an unclassified document sent from the American Embassy in Beijing to the Secretary of State in 2018. It said this about the Wuhan Institute of Virology's newly established BSL-4 laboratory, quote, "This state-of-the-art facility is designed for prevention and control research on diseases that require the highest level of biosafety and biosecurity containment. Scientists hope the lab will contribute to the development of new antiviral drugs and vaccines, but its current productivity is limited by a shortage of the highly trained technicians and investigators required to safely operate a BSL-4 laboratory and a lack of clarity in related Chinese government policies and guidelines," end quote.
Yeah, so this is again the idea that all of these goals, this mission of collecting these viruses and predicting and preventing pandemics is a very noble idea, but the execution is extremely flawed. So there are too many areas where risk is generated and there's nothing to counter those risks.
It's concerning that they would build and open a lab if they didn't have enough qualified people to staff it.
So I think that this seems quite common in China, is that people are under a lot of pressure to excel and to beat the competition internationally. So if you have to beat all these labs that are decades ahead of you, what do you need to do? So you need to do things more efficiently, not just in terms of cost, but in terms of time. So an experiment that could take you only a few weeks at BSL-2 could take you like a year at BSL-3 because it's so much more restrictive to do that type of work, and only a very small number of people are allowed to work at BSL-3. In a lot of cases, I think that corners are cut and people take the risk. So in this case, if you look at the scientists in Wuhan, they had been handling these viruses in the caves and low biosafety for more than a decade before the pandemic. So why go to BSL-3 where everything is more cumbersome? I think that their guards had been lowered. For them, it was strategically important for them to be doing the work quickly and cost efficiently. And the way to do that was to do it at BSL-2.
Speaking of BSL-2, BSL-3, if biosafety levels aren't internationally standardized, do these levels have any meaning when we're talking about them between countries? If we're looking at or talking about a BSL-2 level lab in the United States, is that even comparable to a BSL-2 level lab in China?
Even within the US, I would say that BSL-2 is highly variable. So you can look even within a single building, and a BSL-2 on one floor is one thing, and a BSL-2 on another floor is totally different. So to think about it, China versus US, you're looking at two very different spectrums of BSL-2, even compared to each other.
Going back to US funding of these experiments in China, how do you even know you're saying the same thing? If I'm talking to a scientist leading the Wuhan Institute of Virology and I say, all the labs you're going to be doing this research in are BSL-3, right? And that scientist says yes, that scientist could be saying the truth, but mean something entirely different than what I'm asking him. I made this same analogy when you and I first spoke, Alina, but I think it bears repeating because it's a topic that I'm very passionate about. Nuclear power, right? I'm a big proponent of nuclear power. I think we should build much more of it here in the United States, in addition to green energy. But I also believe that nuclear power needs to be very safe, right? You don't want people walking around with radioactive materials. You don't want to have a potential Fukushima-like event, or God forbid, a Chernobyl event. But the way that we prevent those things from happening is having very strict standards and safety protocols around how nuclear power plants operate. And again, and I said this in our first conversation, it sounds to me like if we had the same sloppiness in terms of how we define safety, no international standards, we don't exactly know what's happening floor to floor, it feels like we'd have Fukushimas all the time. So why, when this is the Michael is frustrated and bewildered episode, ladies and gentlemen, why, when we're talking about such deadly pathogens like Ebola, why are these standards not super strict? Why are they changing floor to floor, even within the United States? Why isn't there an international body that investigates kind of like the UN inspected weapons caches in the 2000s? Why aren't we doing everything worldwide to prevent a deadly virus from escaping a lab?
I think this is because of one big difference between nuclear fallout versus a pandemic caused by a lab accident. With nuclear accidents, it's usually a big boom, and there's no way you can assign it to nature. Some people try, but it becomes quite obvious that it's because of the nuclear plant. But in the case of lab escapes, there's a lot of people like, oh, it can't be those noble virologists. It must be that market vendor, that wildlife vendor down the street. So there's a lot of reluctance to accept and acknowledge that lab accidents happen and that these can cause pandemics. So there's actually a journalist and a professor of journalism in the States. Her name is Alison Young. She actually wrote a book on this too. It's called Pandora's Gamble. So I'll pitch her book. and so she has been covering all these lab accidents in the US for well over a decade. And she says that the vast majority of these biosafety lapses are kept hidden from the public. So compared to nuclear accidents, I would say that with lab accidents, with pathogen accidents, there's a lot more covering up happening. There's a lot more of like, oh, it's not going to cause a sizable outbreak. So we don't have to be transparent of that. We don't need like investigators coming in to certify every single lab. Even when those accidents happen, it's not published. In comparison, let's say if you look at plane crashes, when a plane crashes, there's also some investigations happening to figure out exactly what happened and then to try and develop protocols to improve or to innovate so that those problems don't continue. But in the case of lab releases of these viruses, for example, there's very little transfer of knowledge. So barely any investigation is done. And even when an investigation is done, that knowledge of what the problem is not shared widely. So the whole field is not able to move forward together.
So I'm struggling here, Alina, because what it seems like you're saying is that the two things that are preventing strict international agreed upon safety protocols and investigatory bodies that make sure that these safety protocols are adhered to are ego within the scientific community, like the pride of individual scientists who believe that they're above these regulations, and also plausible deniability that if something were to escape a lab, that there would be no repercussions because scientists could lie and say that it has natural origin. What you're saying is basically, if I'm understanding you correctly, if there were a way for Boeing to blame all of their plane crashes throughout history on birds in their engines, that Boeing would do that if they could. I think what I'm struggling with here is, like, I'm talking with you right now, and you strike me as an honest person who is doing her best to be careful in her research, who is striving for the truth, who is open to other possibilities regarding the origins of COVID. You come from a very prestigious background. I'm talking with you. I respect you. You seem honest. But it seems like the implications of what you're saying is that there are a lot of dishonest scientists working in these labs. I mean, am I understanding you correctly? I don't want to believe that.
I think that as a scientist and other scientists who've been in academia and maybe even biotech for long enough, you know that not all scientists are saints, right? So there's a huge reproducibility crisis in published science. So a lot of studies in science actually cannot be reproduced. So the findings are not robust. And some of it is just due to how fast the work is done with very little checks. But part of it is also due to bad actors. So bad actors, you like to think of people as either good or bad. But in between that, there's a huge spectrum. So a lot of people are just rushing through work without doing the proper controls and checks, or people who are hiding data that counters their claims, or people who are faking data. So there's this whole spectrum of people who are incentivized to do unscientific things because they're human. So I don't think that it's an all scientists dishonest versus all scientists are honest. No, I think that's too simplistic. You really have to look at the scientific community as a body of people doing what's best for each of themselves.
Sure. I totally understand that. You can find that within any organization. You can find that within a police department, within an organization of scientists. You can find that in the entertainment industry, going back to Me Too. Within any group of people, it's not that one particular group of individuals is less or more moral, right?
Scientists like to believe that we are. So a lot of scientists like to believe, yeah.
But the issue is not individual, to your point. It's systemic. And what I mean by that is the way that you incentivize or disincentivize good or bad behavior, understanding that all humans can potentially behave good or badly, is through systematized incentives and disincentives. So understanding that scientists are human, just like the rest of us, right? I'm not pointing a finger at scientists here. But I keep going back because it's my own industry. The way that you prevent something like Me Too from happening again is you create strict guidelines and strict penalties that punish bad behavior and incentivize good behavior. So my question is, again, keeping it away from scientists are good or bad, like scientists are individuals, just like all of us. Why isn't there a structure that promotes good behavior and prevents bad behavior? Why isn't there a structure that weeds out the scientists who are bad, just like we need that in police unions, just like we need that in Hollywood?
There's no incentive for this at all. So science does progress slowly. So even though a lot of studies are not reproducible, eventually the truth will out. So it's just that it moves so slowly. So even when there are clear problems with papers, even in prestigious journals, and I would say actually especially in prestigious journals, the authors and the editors will fight you for months and months and maybe even years before they issue a correction. So it does move very slowly, and there's no incentive to force these journals or scientists to issue corrections or to not publish fraudulent claims. So I know that sounds kind of surprising, but I mean, I think part of it is that scientists believe that we are capable of self-regulation. And you can see this in a lot of letters that have been published over the last year by virologists. So dozens of them have signed these letters saying we're doing good on our own. No problems ever happen in the US. And no one needs to come in and look at us. We don't need any external oversight. We don't need more regulation. So there's this strong belief that scientists can autocorrect and self-supervise. But I think this is completely untenable.
No organization, no one can self-police. That's why, like, when a police department is accused of malfeasance, you have an external investigator who is not part of that police department investigate, because they're not subject to the pressures that someone investigating from within the police department would be subject to. Similarly, if the president of the United States or the executive branch is accused of bad behavior, you have a special investigator from outside the executive branch investigate. It boggles my mind because we understand intrinsically that any organization that needs to be investigated for bad behavior has to be investigated by someone outside of that organization for obvious reasons. It saddens me, I suppose. And I know we're speaking with a broad brush here. And again, I'm of the belief that I'm sure, like most organizations of people, that the overwhelming majority of scientists want to do good work, want to follow the rules, want to be safe. But it just boggles my mind that anyone would fight against an external body because we're all flawed and none of us are going to see our own blind spots.
Yeah, I mean, I do find the position of these virologists very unreasonable as well, that they do not want any external oversight and they don't want external stakeholders to be involved in discussions about gain-of-function research of concern. So the fact that these accidents can lead to millions of people dying, I think already makes it a requirement.
Yeah.
Not like a optionality for external stakeholders to come in and to be part of the conversation about this. So I think that the claims that we're good and no accident ever led to a pandemic, these claims that they're trying to have, it is so disconnected from reality.
Let's move to point 4 of your essay, in which you write, quote, The hypothesis that COVID-19 came from an animal in the Huanan seafood market in Wuhan is not supported by strong evidence, end quote. So why not? And how is this connected to COVID's evolutionary tree? And what is an evolutionary tree?
Yeah, so maybe here it's good to summarize what the strongest case for zoonotic origin is.
Yes, please.
So what had been claimed by some scientists is that if you look at the early cases, they seem to all circle around the market in Wuhan that was selling those animals, and that the virus must have jumped 2 times. 2 different lineages of that virus jumped 2 times at that market in Wuhan. So the B lineage jumped first, and then the A lineage jumped later at that market in late 2019. The problem with these 2 claims is that if you look at the early cases, the whole world already knows that these cases were identified using a highly biased criteria. So the Chinese investigators at the time already said so in early 2020, back when they were saying that this came from the market, by the way. So in January 2020, the Chinese government had announced to the whole world that the pandemic likely started in that market. So there was no covering up of a natural origin at the time. They had specifically looked for cases who had visited the market or were exposed to people who were from that market. And they were only testing cases that came from the hospitals near the market, as well as the district of the market. So based on these criteria, that's why if you look at where all these cases live, it looks like it's a big bullseye around that market. It's because of that search criteria. And then the second thing about the 2 jumps has been completely refuted by new data. So there's a lab in China that recently released more early sequences, and this PI has been shut out of his lab. He's being punished severely for his work on COVID-19. So he released these sequences this year, showing that essentially the pandemic preceded the market. So the cases at the market was definitely not the cases that started the pandemic. And that instead of 2 spillovers, it's most likely a single introduction into people. So these 2 arguments for a zoonotic origin have been completely refuted.
To go back to something you said about how virologists, seemingly worldwide, not wanting external oversight, that they have this release valve, so to speak, where if something does escape from a lab, they can always potentially point to a natural origin instead. And I guess my assumption is that's what you're pointing to here, that the scientists or the Chinese government potentially knew that it escaped from the lab in Wuhan, but they had plausible deniability to point to the wet market.
Yes, but I would give people even more benefit of the doubt. So back in 2019, the main prior that a lot of people had was the 2003 SARS epidemic. So when they found that there were some cases from the market, even though there were also cases not from the market, the first assumption that a lot of investigators made in China was that this was 2003 SARS happening again. If you look at the messages sent out by some of the early whistleblowers at the time, they were like, it's from the market. 2003 SARS is happening again. Everyone watch out, watch yourselves, take care, don't go to the market, don't be exposed to these animals. So that was the prevailing hypothesis at the time, that this was just a natural outbreak happening again, just like it did 2 decades before. It was only later, in mid-2020, that the Chinese government reversed their stance and said that, it looks like the market was just a super spreader event amongst people, that it was also a victim of the pandemic. But in early January, they were just telling the whole world it was the illegally sold animals at that market. So I don't think that it was, from the beginning, a way to deflect from the lab. I do think that it was later on, as no evidence for a natural origin was unearthed, they started to realize that this market was no longer a viable hypothesis as the default hypothesis for this pandemic.
Right. So to make sure that I'm following you correctly, COVID-19 is a SARS virus, and the 2003 SARS virus had a natural origin. So their best guess right out of the gate was, okay, SARS virus 2003, natural origin, SARS virus 2019, natural origin.
Yes. And I think that it's not just even the public that thinks this, but even a lot of scientists have very strong priors. So a lot of virologists and infectious diseases experts, especially, in their minds, this sort of thing is just happening all the time. Viruses jumping into people, it's happening all the time. So why would a lab leak be top of the mind? That being said, though, I think it's important to note that actually the first people to suggest a lab origin were people in China, and specifically Chinese scientists or Chinese technicians. So people who had sequenced the first genome of COVID-19, some scientists who were living in Wuhan, they immediately said, but there are these Wuhan labs here collecting specifically these viruses and then doing some risky work with them. So it could have come from that lab too, not just the market.
In the essay, you write, quote, "The viruses that infected people linked to the market were most likely not the earliest form of the virus that started the pandemic, end quote. And I want to focus in on that phrase, most likely. So is there any way to know what the earliest form of this virus is, and how could we know? What evidence would we be looking for?
So the problem is that investigators were not allowed into Wuhan. So international scientists were not allowed to go in there early in the pandemic. Otherwise, I think a lot more data would be available, especially in the early cases and the sequences. And the reason why a lot of scientists use words like most likely or strongly suggests is that we have been trained professionally to use these sort of hedging words. So we never go in with, we know that this is happening. Even when you have like multiple lines of direct evidence, most scientists will not say that they know that a particular thing has happened. So they'll say most likely. In this case, I would say that the available data, though, already very strongly indicates a single introduction of the virus that caused all the known cases to date. But I will also point out that the Chinese government may know of cases even before the December cases. And whether they manage to get any sequences out of that, I think that would be highly illuminating as to how long the virus might have been circulating in people even before the market cases and what other sequences might have been discovered.
What is the best case scenario for why the Chinese government and the Wuhan Institute of Virology have not been cooperating with investigators? You hear that, you hear the lack of cooperation, and I think it's easy for the mind to jump to, well, that's evidence of lab leak, right? Because if they had nothing to hide, so to speak, they would let investigators in. Is there a steel-manned case for why they would refuse cooperation?
This refusal to cooperate was already happening with the 2003 SARS epidemic. So even back then, when WHO investigators came to Guangzhou to take a look, they were already hiding patients. So they were hiding the patients in elevators, they were hiding them in ambulances and driving them all around town so that the international investigators wouldn't see them. This is not something that only happened specifically to COVID-19. The Chinese government refusing to cooperate, it's hard to say whether this is only a China thing or whether any country would have done it too, right? So like, what if this had happened in some other country? Would they have allowed US investigators to go in and take a look too? And so the problem here is that there is no pandemic treaty with those kind of terms. Like, early cases found, everybody goes in to take a look. No, there's nothing like that right now. And there's no incentive for a country to share all these things, because then you might have all these travel bans or a lot of anti-China sentiment coming up. For that reason, a lot of key information about human-to-human transmission, about the number of cases, about the types of transmission through the air, this kind of data was sat on by people who had them. And the Chinese government, even in March 2020, put down a ban on Chinese scientists publishing on the origins of COVID-19. So there was a nationwide instruction not to let any of this key information out of the country.
That is really something, hearing about how back in 2003, when the SARS virus started to spread, they were driving around infected patients in ambulances to keep them from investigators. That doesn't bode well for the state of COVID-19's origins. We discussed your fifth point already, so I just want to skip to the final section of your essay in which you write, quote, "The pandemic could have been caused by any of hundreds of virus species, at any of tens of thousands of wildlife markets, in any of thousands of cities, and in any year. But it was a SARS-like coronavirus with a unique furin cleavage site that emerged in Wuhan less than 2 years after scientists, sometimes working under inadequate biosafety conditions, proposed collecting and creating viruses of that same design," end quote. To my point at the start of this conversation, I want to do my best to try and represent the opposition to your view in the best light possible. I don't want this to be super biased, even if I find your case for a lab leak very compelling. And one of the best arguments that I've heard against your essay, against your theory around the lab leak, is that you've collected a lot of compelling evidence, but not proof. You've shown that the murder suspect didn't particularly like the victim. You've shown that the suspect traveled to the town where the victim was murdered, but you haven't produced the murder weapon. In a letter to the editor published by the New York Times in response to your essay, Florence Debarret, an evolutionary biologist and senior researcher at the French National Center for Scientific Research, wrote, in part, quote, "These accusations are very serious, yet the case made by Dr. Chan rests entirely on speculation. Critical facts are ignored, such as the presence of live wild animals involved in the emergence of SARS in the market where many of the first people known to have gotten COVID worked or shopped. In my view, proper scientific analysis, which a majority of experts agree support a natural origin, are misrepresented or inappropriately dismissed by Dr. Chan, end quote. What would you say to this critique?
Of course, there's no proof, because if I had proof, then I wouldn't be saying that both natural and lab hypotheses should be investigated. So I think that the problem here is that somehow scientists are very comfortable accusing wildlife traders, but they're not comfortable accusing their peers. Not surprising, but it has to be pointed out that all these virologists have spent decades pointing the finger at people who sell animals and saying these uncivilized people selling animals are causing diseases in our human population. But when it comes to their own, they're like, oh, no, you better have proof. Otherwise, you cannot say that so-and-so had a lab accident. I think that is almost classist. There's a real problem here that people are like really happy to scapegoat people who sell raccoon dogs at the market. But when it comes to people doing risky research, their peers, professionals, they're like, oh, we cannot do anything about them unless someone has a videotape of someone getting spilled on with a tube that's labeled like SARS-like virus. So I think that there are double standards at play here. And I think that a lot of people would like to hear both sides. And so how that could happen is that if you have podcasts or interviews where you bring both people to the table, so people like me versus people like Flo or others who strongly believe in the natural origin, why not come to the table and directly talk to each other, go over the facts together so that listeners can tell who is making more sense. But I think that the ideal version of this would be if some National Academy of Sciences actually organized a big conference or a big forum where lots of scientists come together and all go through the facts together so that there is a consensus on what the data says or does not say. So I think this would be the ideal thing to happen, and I wish that it happened already. So it's already 4.5 years since the pandemic started, and no such forum has occurred.
Yeah, which is surprising. I mean, it's surprising that as an outsider looking in, that these kinds of dialogues haven't happened, especially when both theories are plausible. And to your point, there's no definitive proof for either case. What surprises, and I'll be honest, kind of distresses me, is that the criticism you've received from your peers has been incredibly harsh and often seems quite personal. Two of your colleagues, Vincent Rocaniello, a Higgins professor in the Department of Microbiology and Immunology at Columbia University's College of Physicians and Surgeons, and Paul Offit, director of the Vaccine Education Center at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and co-inventor of a rotavirus vaccine, have been very critical of your hypothesis publicly. Dr. Robert Gary, a professor of microbiology and immunology at Tulane Medical School, called you a, quote, dangerous young investigator, end quote, in an email to a senior advisor at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. And Dr. Anthony Fauci, who you've mentioned several times here, said, referring to you on the CBS Morning Show in June, quote, she's a pretty fuzzy person, quite frankly, end quote, when it comes to your opinions on COVID-19's origins, and said in reference to your recent piece in the New York Times, quote, I'm surprised the New York Times wrote that, end quote. I think you'd agree that scientists should challenge each other's work. I mean, that's the whole point. You have a hypothesis, other scientists challenge it. You're all searching for truth together. So critiques are not out of the ordinary. But why do you think that these critiques of your theory, of your research on this subject, are so harsh and often seem so dismissive and personal?
I think this is because I was one of the few scientists who were taken seriously about raising a lab leak origin of COVID-19 in 2020. With my affiliation with the Broad Institute and MIT and Harvard, this led a lot of journalists to take me more seriously. And this was back in early 2020 when the climate was a racist right-wing hypothesis to even say that this could have accidentally leaked from a lab. I guess my speech about this, or my writing about this, and my tweeting about this, it opened the door for more and more people and scientists to start questioning the narrative that had been published in the top journals at the time, that it was a conspiracy theory, to even suggest it was from a lab, that no lab-based hypotheses are even plausible. And I don't take any of these attacks personally, because I know that I could have been anyone and the attacks would still have been coming at me. So I think that these attacks are indicative of defense, their sense of fear that more and more people are taking this lab hypothesis very seriously, and it's going to be investigated at some point, and maybe evidence is going to come out and indict the whole field of virology, according to Vincent Rocaniello. For me, actually, I don't think that if a lab accident caused a pandemic, that would be the indictment of virology. I think that the indictment of virology is how many of these scientists are closing ranks, covering up, refusing to let other people question their story that this came from a raccoon dog in that market.
people can be at fault for an accident, but it's not an indictment of the entire organization, the entire industry, the entire group of people. But to your point, if there's a conspiracy, if there's a cover up to prevent that accident from coming to light or to keep people from being held accountable, that is pretty damning. But I do want to circle back to something you said where you would be getting this critique no matter who you were. I'm not sure I entirely agree with that, because what seems to be invoked a lot is your youth. When they critique you, a lot of people will keep referencing how young you are. And I'll just say it kind of pisses me off.
I mean, I don't mind being called young. I guess what they're saying is that I am inexperienced, and some will say that I am an epistemic trespasser. So that's their way of saying only virologists get a say on this topic. But that is just right on the outset, false. A lot of scientists have enough training to look at data and understand what it means. So you don't have to be a vaccine developer to be able to look at vaccine data and tell when it's working versus when it has adverse side effects. So the fact that it's trying to shut everyone out, except for people only in their field who are mostly afraid of backlash if this came from a lab, it's a form of insecurity.
Sometimes you've implied it, sometimes you've outright stated it, is a kind of gatekeeping elitism within either virology or certain aspects of the scientific community. Do I have that right?
Yes, and I think that's a very important incident to point out. So this happened in early 2020. There was a New York Times reporter who was trying to figure out if the virus might have come from a lab. So he reached out to these virologists, including Robert Gary. So Robert Gary is one of the virologists you mentioned who calls me a dangerous young investigator. So this New York Times journalist had asked them, is there a way to tell if this was a natural virus that spilled over at the market versus a natural virus that leaked out of a lab? And Robert Gary wrote in his messages, very credible journalist, but like every reporter can be misled. And his colleague said, I gotta say, he pretty much nailed it. Let's not tell him. You can't ignore him, can't give him the scientific story. That will only lead to follow-up question. So later on in 2024, this year, the journalist from the New York Times, he said that these efforts to throw him off track influenced the entire New York Times coverage of the issue and likely contributed to it being dropped in 2020. He said that he had been a victim of deception.
I want to circle back to something else that Anthony Fauci said on the CBS Morning Appearance. He said, quote, the overwhelming number of virologists in the country, they feel that the evidence, though not convincing, is more suggestive of it being a natural origin, end quote. And what I'm trying to understand, Alina, as a layperson, right, someone who's not a scientist, who is far from an expert in this field, I'm trying to understand that statement, specifically the though not convincing part, and square it with all of this incredible pushback that you're receiving from all corners of the virology community. Because if the evidence for a natural origin is not convincing, then why isn't your hypothesis possible? And I think I can anticipate your answer, right? Because you've stated this outright, is that scientists are closing rank. They don't want to believe or admit to themselves or admit to others that people within their field can cause an outbreak like this. It's just upsetting to me that scientists, as famous and revered and respected as Dr. Anthony Fauci, they could say something like the most likely origin of this virus is natural, but we don't have entirely convincing evidence. And then out of the other half of their mouth say, oh, and also this other theory is BS. If you can't prove that your origin is the origin, then you need to be respectful of other theories. I'm ranting now, but it's just upsetting to me that someone can go on TV and say, we don't have all the proof for this theory, but any other theory is baloney.
Well, the nice thing is that Anthony Fauci's hypothesis or his stance today was my stance in 2020. So maybe in another 4 years, he will catch up to where I am. So, so there's a lot of missing pieces of key evidence, right? So with so much key evidence missing, and with all this circumstantial evidence very strong for a lab, and so some would say even for the market is strong, I give it to them. You can't rule either one out, and you can't say that either one is a conspiracy theory. Both of them require a lot of cover-up. Both of them require a lot of evidence to have been hidden away. I am quite optimistic. I think that there are people who know how this happened, and it's just a waiting game at this point. So with something that caused so many millions of people to die, I think there's no way that no one knows. So it's more about waiting for the climate to change, waiting for the right moment when a whistleblower could say, this is the time. Now I'm safe. Now I'll take the evidence that I have and I'll show it to everyone and reveal how this pandemic started. So I'm optimistic that time is going to come. So I would say to people who are condemning the lab hypothesis, even as a conspiracy to today, stop doing that, because you're destabilizing public trust in science and government. And if evidence for lab leak were to ever surface, this would be the worst example of scientists and government leaders covering up a catastrophe of this scale.
On this topic of cover-ups and plausible deniability and pride and closing ranks, this is a topic that I've discussed a lot on this podcast, which is the importance of and declining nature of Americans' trust in institutions and our leaders and experts that we look to for guidance. And it feels more difficult than ever to separate truth from falsehood about things that really matter. Because bad science communication, some of it unintentional and some of it, as we've noted, willful, I feel like that had a sizable effect on who decided to take the COVID vaccine or not. And I think that once doubt enters the mind, whether that doubt is reasonable or not, it's hard for that person to believe again. The origins of COVID-19 and the vaccine's effectiveness, in my opinion, are just unrelated, right? Like whether or not scientists are being honest or not, honest with themselves or honest with others about the origins of COVID-19 is an entirely separate issue from how effective or ineffective the COVID-19 vaccines are. But I think that they've been grouped together in many people's minds as being related under a kind of mistrusting elites umbrella. So I think that some people might hear about the lab leak theory, right? Even if it is the correct theory, and they think to themselves, well, if I can't trust the supposed consensus from scientists on COVID's origins, they're probably not being honest about vaccines. What would you say to that? Do you worry about people drawing these kinds of connections? And what can we do to prevent this sort of disbelief cascade from happening?
I think for the majority of the public, it's really hard to interpret data, like scientific data. So the question is not what is the data? The question is who do we trust? And based on that principle, I think there were some public health experts early in the pandemic who decided that the best thing to do was to make science unassailable. So if you make science unassailable, then nobody can question anything coming down from the top, right? It's like, go take your vaccines, mask up, don't mask up. I don't know, just all sorts of things coming down, all these instructions coming down. They didn't want people to question any of it. And if you questioned any of it, you were anti-science, you were anti-vax, you were anti-GMO, you're right-wing conspiracy theorists. They were trying to make it so that people would do what they wanted them to do. So their form of science communication then was to project a lot of confidence, to really gain a lot of people's trust and reliance, and to make people do what was best for society at large at that time in the pandemic. The problem with this is that, of course, science is not unassailable. Science works by continuously poking holes in each other's hypothesis until the right one emerges. For me as a scientist, looking at other scientists, other public health experts repeatedly saying things that they knew they didn't have enough evidence for, things like even the World Health Organization was saying it's not spreading human to human. Like the phrase that they like to use is no evidence. So they would say things like no evidence of human to human transmission of COVID-19, no evidence of airborne transmission of COVID-19, no evidence of a lab origin of COVID-19. So they would use this phrase, no evidence, to try and deflect everyone's questions.
Yeah, it's something that I've been critical of, which is this idea of there being capital T, capital S, the science, right? Like, you know better than me, science is a process of discovery that is refined over time. And it seems, to your point, Alina, over the last 4 years especially, there's been this idea, almost like in a religious sort of way, where there is capital T, capital S, the science that cannot be challenged. And it's really dangerous, I think, because science is a process, things will change. But if you say that something is set in stone as the science, and then that science changes, because that's what science does, you risk really weakening the public's trust. Whereas if you were to say, hey, this is the evidence we have now, but hey, we're going to keep testing. And if it changes in 6 months, we'll update you, right? We're going to keep letting you know the best information. Why not go that route? Why talk about science like it's solidified in stone? And then if it does change, you have to get defensive. Why not say it's going to change? It changes all the time. But as we get better and better at it, we'll update the public. Why go that other route?
I think the problem is that people had all these good intentions that didn't pan out the way that they expected. So, with the World Health Organization, they were trying to be really nice to China, trying to coax more information out of China. That's why they played along and said all these things like no human-to-human transmission, that kind of thing. And then you had these scientists, public health leaders who were like, oh, it's not spreading through the air. Masks don't really protect you, because they wanted people to not mad rush to the nearest pharmacy and hoard all the mask. And then later they changed their tune completely. And then with the vaccines, they were like, oh, you're never going to get COVID if you take the vaccine, because they wanted people to all go take the vaccine. So the problem is that again and again, we've seen that these guys don't know what they're talking about. These guys, the experts, actually do not have enough evidence, and they've made overly strong claims that turned out to be false. And that really hurts public trust. Like I started in this pandemic being like very reverent of public health instruction. Whatever the World Health Organization or the CDC said, I would take it as truth. But after the pandemic, I have to say my eyes have been really open to all the human flaws in these organizations. And it's not because of evil people. It's just, again, all these good intentions gone awry.
A lack of humility.
People trying so hard to get other people to do what they want that they try to fake it till they make it. So, the vaccine's amazing. You'll never get COVID again. So everyone, please go and get it. And then when you see that actually it doesn't prevent transmission or infection, I'm not sure it's a lack of humility. I think it's just desperation and lack of the ability to see how things could go really wrong if they keep
long-term thinking.
Long-term thinking.
Yeah. Look, Japanese automakers make really good cars, right? I've owned a Toyota, and they break down very rarely, right? Like they're much more reliable in terms of how long they last before needing maintenance than, let's say, a German car, right? But if in my attempt to sell a Toyota, I told the customer, this car will never, ever break down. And then that car, let's say 5-10 years from now, needs a repair, the customer I sold the car to isn't going to trust me again. Whereas if I were to just say, the actual truth is this car is super reliable, and for the price, it's going to break down very rarely compared to any other car on the market. That's a really strong statement, but at least it gives you the out where if the Toyota breaks down at some point, you're not looked at as a liar. I don't want to turn this into a therapy session, Alina, but it seems so obvious to me that you always want to be honest with people, and you want to give yourself an out so that you're not defensive if all of a sudden that thing that you tried selling to people doesn't turn out the way you thought it would.
Yeah, I think a lot of scientists are allergic to saying, I don't know. I haven't looked at the data closely enough yet, which I try to do more frequently. It's hard because in science, you select for people who are like know-it-alls, right? So a lot of scientists like to know everything all the time. But at some point, you really have to acknowledge that, no, I do not know everything all the time. And actually, most of the times, I do not know everything. So I just think that it's better if scientists can level the public more often and just say like, okay, we also are figuring things out, but we would very much like you to take the vaccines, because as far as we can see, this is the best way to end the pandemic as quickly as possible or to get it under control. I wish that there was that kind of honesty rather than take the vaccines, you'll never get COVID again.
Yes. All of us want to feel respected, regardless of what the context is for that respect, regardless of the situation, whether you're being sold a car or sold a vaccine or whatever it is. You just want to feel like you're being treated like a fellow adult rather than a child. Like even children don't like being talked to like children. So adults certainly don't like it. But to take us to our final question, Alina, and I really appreciate the time that you've given us today. In the second to last paragraph of your New York Times essay, you write, quote, a successful investigation of the pandemic's root cause would have the power to break a decades-long scientific impasse on pathogen research safety, determining how governments will spend billions of dollars to prevent future pandemics. A credible investigation would also deter future acts of negligence and deceit by demonstrating that it is indeed possible to be held accountable for causing a viral pandemic. Last but not least, people of all nations need to see their leaders, and especially their scientists, heading the charge to find out what caused this world-shaking event. Restoring public trust in science and government leadership requires it, end quote. And you've said as much multiple times throughout this conversation, and it's something that I have a lot of respect for. You're humble about the fact that you might be wrong, that there could be a natural origin. And it seems like the thing that you care most about is that people can trust the scientific community, can trust their leaders, and that establishing that trust is really important to prevent something like the COVID-19 pandemic from happening again, or an even worse one happening. What advice do you have for people like me, people listening to this podcast, who don't know who or what to trust today? People who don't want to fall victim to conspiracy theory thinking, but also don't know where to get reliable, trustworthy information. What would you say to them?
The responsibility really lies with the media. So I think having more platforms where diverse opinions are directly exchanged amongst experts, I think that is very important. So I know that some people say that this might create some sort of false equivalency. So let's say in the case of climate change, if you get like the one climate change scientist who says that climate change is not happening versus the scientist who represents a majority who says it's happening, then there might be some false equivalency there. But in most like scientific issues, there's a lot of unknown and there isn't that clear cut of an answer. So for example, with origins, what should have happened early on in early 2020 is getting multiple scientists with different opinions to state the case and say what needs to be investigated, what type of evidence needs to be found to decide what was the actual origin of COVID-19. To make it short, I don't think that the public is able to do that. I don't think that a regular person can like spend hundreds of hours in their lives just like listening to all of the expert testimonies on every single topic, right? So I think the responsibility is on the media.
I so appreciate your work, Alina, and especially after this conversation, I appreciate the respect that you offer colleagues who disagree with you, even and especially when they don't offer that same respect to you. Thank you for the work that you've been doing, figuring out what the origins of COVID-19 are. Thank you for staying steadfast in your resolve. And today, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Michael.